In today's video, we're going to be discussing the competitive merits each of the top decks possess and what value they bring to the new meta landscape. It's your boy Beats by Ash, back at it again with another banger, and the OPO3 pre-release has just concluded. I had a great time at the ones I was able to go to, and I hope you had an amazing time as well. I really hope you guys pulled all the cards that you wanted and you enjoyed yourself as much as I did. And because of that, I'm going to be giving away 4 copies of the promo VV card you got from the pre-release. So if you want to win those, make sure to smash the like button, turn post notifications on, and subscribe to the channel. And as well, leave a comment down below and let me know how you're feeling about OPO3. And 1 week after the release of this video, I will pick someone to win the giveaway. Now, without further ado, let's get into the goo. Now, this discussion is by no means a definitive tier list, but I've compiled a total of 7 different decks for you guys that I feel are worth talking about because I believe they have a high potential when we're looking at winning a premier event such as a Treasure Cup or a regional. Or if you're just like me, then you probably want to win a bunch of locals so you can get those Tournament Pack 3 packs, which personally, I really want to get one of those Winter Pack Jewelry Bonnie meets Kentucky Fried Chicken. I just think that card looks awesome. Let me know what you think is the best card in that tournament pack. The point of this video is so we can discuss some of the pros and cons of these decks and when I feel like you should bring one of these depending on what you meta call, so you can make the most informed decision and have the highest chance to perform at your all-time best, because as you know, I'm the best of all time for a reason, and I'm here to bless you with another free value session once again. So I know there are a couple clear winners in OPO3, and I think we should just start off with those. So obviously, the cancer that is known as red is still around and terrorizing the meta. But now, in OPO3, we once again get another competitively viable mono red leader. We didn't need that, Bandai. And there are a couple other cards that I feel are just generally toxic, such as Buggy and 5-cost Marco. Why is this card in the game? So starting off, we're going to be talking about Ace. So Ace is kind of nice in the sense that I feel like if you're trying to be competitive, Ace is going to be a very strong choice in the early stages of the meta, because just like Red Luffy took the position of the mid-range strategy in OPO2 and somewhat in OPO1, that's kind of the role that I feel Ace fits into. And there are also a couple of obvious advantages that I feel Ace brings to the table. One of the biggest advantages I think that Ace brings to the table is the fact that obviously in OPO2, there are quite a few powerful Whitebeard Pirates cards, such as 7-drop Ace. That card is literally just broken. And then you've also got Seaquake. You also have, Edward Newgate. You got a couple other honorable mentions. But the thing about 7-cost Ace and as well as Seaquake, those cards require that you're using a Whitebeard Pirates leader. And in OPO2, that was made fair because Whitebeard made himself take a life at the end of the turn. And, I guess you could consider that an advantage, but it is somewhat of a disadvantage because you're forced to play one specific play style, which is try to end the game very quickly, because eventually when you're at 0, the guy can just keep punching you in the face. And if you run out of counter, you're just screwed. But with Ace, we kind of just bypass that restriction because now we can use all of the Whitebeard Pirates cards that have that restriction of using a Whitebeard Pirates leader while also just not losing life. And to me, that's one of the biggest advantages I see that Ace brings to the table. And that's also why I feel like he's such a mid-range strategy. Now, I will say, I feel like Ace isn't super advantageous versus any deck specifically, but I like Ace because I feel like you can go 50-50 in almost every matchup, and to me, that's a huge advantage. Well, except, I guess, Blue Doflamingo, you're kind of cucked at that point, but I don't feel like that's that popular of a strategy since it has other, weaknesses, but we'll get into that in a minute. Ace just allows you to have a good shot at beating anyone on any given day. And that's really nice if you're going to a early premier event where you don't know exactly what most of the players are going to be bringing to that tournament. And a lot of people have said that, since Japan and Asia in general, they have the cards about 3 months early than us. And so the meta landscape is kind of strung out to what we somewhat know are the top strategies, but I think everybody can agree in the English game, we tend to find out that insight a lot later than them, even though a lot of those people are being very transparent about those strategies. Some things that became super strong in the end of their metagame were because they were changing what deck they wanted to play in correlation to what decks were being brung to their tournaments. And that's something that a lot of people don't consider because they're just like, these are the best decks, so this strategy has to work in this case. But I really want to open your mind to thinking about how each event is different, and while some decks will remain tier 1 for the course of the meta, there will be quite a bit of decks that will move in between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 2, yada yada yada, and it changes from event to event. And I think that's where Ace will really be able to capitalize, because if you're in an event like, let's say, 2 weeks in to OPO3, you don't necessarily know everyone is going to be bringing Whitebeard. People want to try new things. They want to find out things on their own, even if the Asia meta did not reflect what they want to try out. And for that reason, I think Ace is probably the strongest leader that you can bring into a fresh event in the metagame, just because you can go 50-50 in all those matchups. Now, what I will say about Ace is that there are two distinctive different builds. So you have more of a control build utilizing the new stage card Striker, and I know a lot of people really, really like that card. Personally, I would prefer to go with the other build, which is the more aggressive variant that does not utilize Striker, and that is because while Striker is an insane card on paper because it technically gives you a +1 in card advantage every turn, I don't feel that that is necessarily required to effectively pilot the strategy, and that is because your deck already has access to so many +1s in card advantage and so many searchers in general. Most Ace lists you're going to see will be bringing 4 copies of Buggy, my top pick for the most oppressive card in OPO3, and as well 4 copies of Ezo, the Whitebeard Pirate Searcher, and on top of that, the Whitebeard Pirates event from OPO2, which lets you add any Whitebeard Pirates card. Because of these cards being in the game, I don't feel like Striker is required for this deck, because when you think about it, you can use Ezo to search your Whitebeard Pirates event. Whitebeard Pirates event can then search your Ezo, and as well, Buggy can search your Whitebeard Pirates event, which can get you through that cycle in a different direction. And for that reason, I just don't really see a lot of merit in bringing the Striker build to the tournament, because that build is going to typically perform better against some of the more grindy strategies where you want to beat them in the late game. But I think Zoro is extremely strong, if not the best deck in the meta, and I think the Striker deck just does not perform well into that matchup, and for that reason, I would prefer to bring more of an aggressive build to combat that popular strategy, because at the end of the day, you can still go 50-50 in those matchups where the Striker build might be more effective, but I'm definitely not telling you the Striker build is terrible by any means. I just think it has a different role to play in the meta, and that's something that you'll have to kind of find out on your own, but I hope this kind of gave you a little bit insight on that strategy and what each of them brings to the table. Overall, it's not that much different. It's just one deck plays better in the late grind game, and the other deck is kind of angled towards doing what Zoro is doing rather than going full control, but you still have some of those mid-range elements, and I really like that because I just think that the 7-cost Ace is a super powerful card, especially because of how big the bodies are in OPO3. Someone could have a 5-cost Marco that is technically immortal, and then your Ace reduces it, you kill it with something small, he brings it back, you attack it again with your Ace. I think it's just a nice value exchange, and that just makes Ace a top meta contender in my mind. Also, I feel like people in the early stages won't necessarily understand how to maximize the value from the leader ability. Since it is a new aspect being added to the game, you're going to be able to get wins in the mirror match over other people which are not as strongly versed in that strategy and haven't put in as much time as you. And that's very nice as a person who likes to feel rewarded for the amount of time I put into the game. Moving on, we're going to go ahead and talk about Whitebeard because it presents a couple similar advantages. While you can still utilize the Whitebeard Pirates package to the full advantage, utilizing those cards that have restrictions for a Whitebeard Pirates leader. Number one, you get so much more value from the 9-cost Edward Newgate, and that is because you are almost guaranteed to access that card at least once per game. While you may not play the Buggy Searcher, you definitely are going to play 4 copies of the Whitebeard Pirate Searcher and 4 copies of Ezo, which gives you a high chance to see your Edward Newgate for that 9 Dawn curve. No matter what happens, unless they power creep Edward Newgate, the leader, and the character, playing 9-cost Edward Newgate on curve, allowing yourself to not take a life card at the end of the turn and stabilizing at 2 life with an 8k power base until your next turn is just such an impressive thing to do if your opponent does not have an immediate answer on the following turn. And for that reason, the new Edward Newgate is going to shape up to be a more efficient variant of the OG Strawbeard Pirate variant that was highly utilized in set 2 for its strong level of consistency and the interaction with Edward Newgate on 9 Dawn that I just mentioned. So I think that Edward Newgate is a very strong leader for that aspect, but I would say the biggest advantage it has over Ace is the fact that with Ace versus Katakuri, which is another strong leader, you're pretty much a 50-50 matchup unless you angle your deck towards that strategy. And with Edward Newgate, you straight up just nullify their entire game plan. And I just think that Katakuri is going to be a very popular strategy very early on and as well towards the mid game of the meta. And that's just because Katakuri just shows a lot of the same signs as the purple Kaido did in set 1 in the way that a lot of the games you can win based off of luck. And I think a lot of the people who don't have as much time to put into the game to be rewarded based off of repetitions are really going to resonate with that strategy. So I think it's going to be super popular in the beginning for sure. And that's where I'm kind of like more inclined to play Whitebeard. And, you know, I really enjoy the Big Mom Pirates, like, entire package, the entire strategy. It introduces a whole new way to play the game. And you guys know that I'm all about adding new levels of skill expression to the game. And for that reason, I think Whitebeard is what I'm going to stick with just for now. Because at my locals, a bunch of people are looking to pick up Katakuri. And while I do think that is one of my favorite strategies so far, I just don't think I'm going to be able to obtain the cards right now because so many people are after them. And for that reason, Edward Newgate just seems like a clear, strong choice to combat in my locals until we have the next big event that's going to be going down. And plus, I feel like when you're playing Whitebeard, a lot of the skills that you learn from Whitebeard translate very well into playing Ace because they share a lot of the same cards and as well as Zoro. And also, just having a 6k leader is just so strong. You know, we've seen in OPO4 from some of their early tournaments, Edward Newgate is not going anywhere anytime soon. The deck is still super strong, and I'm excited to see what that Mega Starter deck with the 3 leaders brings. Because there's a new leader with 6k attack, which is the red-purple Luffy, and I'm just wondering what effect that will have on the game since we previously only had one 6k leader. And until then, I just think Edward Newgate is just always a safe choice. Because if you go against people who are just not the most well-versed in keeping up with the meta, going against a 6k leader is just a different way to play the game. Maybe they have played versus Whitebeard, but not in a while, and they get used to going against these other strategies. You can really take advantage of that, and I found from my own personal experiences with Whitebeard, a lot of the skill expression comes from doing bluffs that you would generally use in a poker game. You know, like playing in a way where you may not be able to utilize all of the dawn you left open, but you make your opponent think that you have more events than you do, and because of that, they don't take the risks that are required to push for lethal, and that is just such an amazing aspect to have in your deck, because since it is best of one, we need to have as many ways as possible to affect the state of the game. So I think OPO3 is this time for Edward Newgate. Even with the Moby Dick ban, I don't really think that it did much to the strategy, and I think it's still strongly oppressive. I mean, like I said, Ace is just such a crazy card. Going Ace into 9-cost Newgate into 9-cost Newgate can be attributed as one of the most unfair curves in the game, and oftentimes just feels like you cannot win if the guy has that. And with the added consistency to the strategy, it's just an insane deck to bring at any time in the game. I think this deck will probably retain its tier 1 to tier 1.5 position in the meta pretty much all the way through. Now, moving on to the third red deck is Zoro. Now, like I said, arguably, I think this might just be the best deck in the meta, and for that reason, I just feel like it's going to be a strong deck to bring throughout the entire meta. Plus, if you already had previous repetitions on piloting Zoro effectively, which is not as easy as you think, then you're going to be at a huge advantage. Like my good friend Kyle, shout out to the boy Kyle, he topped a regional with Zoro, and he's probably one of the best people I know, and he was able to do that and win matchups that were not necessarily in his favor just because he's put a lot of time into the deck and learning the interactions, and we've just seen throughout the entire course of the game how far that can take you, with Zoro being extremely complicated in terms of micro interactions when you get into like mirror matches per se, or any like aggro matchup. You know, a lot of it comes down to identifying who is getting the better exchange of value with these cards, and if you're able to master that, Zoro is going to take you a long way. And on top of that, I mentioned some of the most unfair cards in OPO3 are the 5-cost Marco and the 1-cost Buggy, and let's think about it in a vacuum. Buggy is a card that very much resembles another strong Zoro card that we used all the way through OPO2 and partially in OPO1, which is the 1-cost 3K Straw Hat Pirate card, Sunicune. This card was a vanilla, and the only advantage it had over Buggy was the 1K counter, but I don't think that's really necessary. I think Buggy is just extremely unfair. In the Zoro strategy, you might be thinking, well, Buggy, I only have 12 events in my deck, so it's not always going to hit. And that is the case. But the thing is, we don't really care. Even if we miss with our search effect of Buggy, we still have the same stat line that Sunicune presented in OPO1 and OPO2, and that is just insane to me. We're getting a card that somewhat just power creeps the level of searchers in the game. I would say that this is the biggest power creep searcher that we have had thus far. You know, you think about it, even when you miss with that search, it doesn't really matter because now you just do one Dawn leader attach to your Zoro, then your Buggy is 4. That makes your Buggy a 1 Dawn attach to make it a natural attacker to hit any 5K leader. And on top of that, we've also got the new introduction of 4-cost Marshall D. Teach. Shout out to me for not realizing that Marshall D. Teach trashed from field and not hand because I'm just dumb. But it makes a lot more sense when you think about the value that Buggy presents to the deck. And I think Marshall D. Teach is best utilized in the Zoro strategy because one of the biggest negatives to Zoro, which there are not very many negatives, is that in the Whitebeard matchup, you're using a lot of the same cards in general between the decks, but he has a 6K leader. You can't just give all your small guys 1 Dawn and just make them 5K. You now have to make them 6K, and it just subjects you to double taxation without representation. And that's where the Marshall D. Teach is kind of broken in that aspect, because not only are you hitting for 6, which naturally hits their leader, if you attach 1 Dawn to your leader, then now your buggy is 4k. You probably cannot afford to invest Dawn into your buggy to hit them, or maybe you did and it's now tapped. Now your Martial D Teach is hitting for 7, and now you're going to use the effect, trashing your buggy because it was empowered by your leader ability, but boosting Martial D Teach up to an 8k base, and with 1 Dawn attached to Teach, he's now hitting for 9, which is a really strong number, but 8k power is also very strong versus Whitebeard. And also, you're cycling a card. You think about how many on-play effects are so good in the Zoro strategy and red in general. Well, you just remove one, and then you just get to draw another one that has another on-play effect. That just seems insane to me. Oh, and I forgot to mention the most unfair aspect about Zoro. The most powerful card in OPO3, 5-cost Marco, is a natural 7k attacker with only 1 Dawn attached to our leader, which you're pretty much doing every single turn, making it pretty much a free 7k attacker that kills something on play and is also immortal. Now, this deck can pretty much go 50-50 across almost all matchups if you play it effectively. Obviously, there are some disadvantages, such as the Whitebeard matchup, but in general, if you put in enough time, I think you can breach a lot of those gaps that some of those decks have like a slight edge on you with, and that just makes Zoro insane, because you can accommodate the deck to any type of meta. If you feel like there's a lot of Whitebeard, then you can play, a bunch of Martial D Teaches. You can play other cards that have good value for hitting for 6k or more. And if you don't feel like Whitebeard is going to be prevalent, you can make your deck even more low to the ground, which can just straight up go through Katakuri, another powerful strategy, like so fast. You're already favorable with that matchup, but if you tech it to beat that matchup, like it's going to be even better. And so I think this is a really strong deck to consider when we're thinking about what does the deck present. How can we effectively change our Zoro deck list to beat what we feel like people are going to show up with? Because there are a lot of top winning deck lists from Asian players that you're going to see, and you don't want to just net deck those lists and say, okay, this is the best Zoro list, because Zoro is very versatile in that aspect like we just discussed, and I want to make sure you guys understand when you're using someone's deck list like that, why did they play those certain cards? Because you can switch out cards for each matchup, and maybe they played a certain amount of cards in their deck that were good for a matchup that we just don't think is going to be very prevalent at the time of the tournament you're entering. And that's always just something good to consider when we want to bring out our all-time best. The next deck, I feel like, is just insane. Yellow Katakuri. There's a little bit of a debate on what most people believe is the strongest yellow leader. Personally, I think it's Katakuri. Now, some people would argue it is the standard mono yellow Big Mom, but in my mind, Katakuri is just a straight up power creep leader. Let's go ahead and look at the OPO2 Smoker card. Now, that card says if we attach 1 Dawn, our leader conditionally goes to 7k if our opponent has a 0-cost character. With Katakuri, if we attach 1 Dawn, we're always hitting for 7. And in my mind, that is just so irritating, because I like the Smoker deck. I thought it was a fun strategy, just as a lot of people did. And it kind of just makes it like, okay, I guess you can only play Rob Lucci now because the new yellow leader just does what my leader did a bit better. And on top of that, looking at the other person's life and looking at your life just has insane synergies with a lot of the cards themselves. And versus the red matchup, looking at the guy's life can be strongly beneficial to stop him from getting key bombs, which the red archetype has so many bombs, and it also has a plethora of good triggers. It's almost just like the precursor to yellow. It's like, we get all the triggers, but we can't look at our life. And that's why a lot of those good red cards with triggers were just strongly applicable in the OPO3 pre-release, where you could use cards of any color and utilize the yellow Katakuri leader. But in general, yellow Katakuri is basically the new Kaido. And I alluded to that before. And what I mean by that is, in set 1, we would have like a 15 or 16 person tournament, and like 10 to 12 people would play Kaido. I really believe this is just because there are a lot of people in the community that this game tailors to, which want to be competitive, but they don't have as much time to put into learning a strategy and becoming an effective pilot. And that's why Kaido was just such a good pick for that group of people, because a lot of those people, I strongly think they just felt like, okay, I'm not able to win with any other deck, so even though I don't win every time with Kaido, I feel like I win way more with it because it really comes down to a simpler game plan and a lot of RNG aspects, such as putting out your 10 cost Kaido. And with yellow, a lot of those people from that same niche are going to translate really well into yellow. Because unlike Kaido, yellow is just a consistent Kaido that doesn't require a stage and gets to do more powerful things. Really, it doesn't even matter if you have a bad matchup. If you hit a Perospero early on or a Charlotte Cracker and just generate a body that essentially has rush because it was summoned on your opponent's turn, you're just in an insane swing of tempo and resource advantage. And for that reason, I think yellow is definitely just a deck that you could bring to any tournament in OPO3 and have a strong chance of, performing decently well. And on top of that, I would say the biggest disadvantage of yellow is that when you go against a Whitebeard player, their game plan just straight up counters you. And I talked about this a little bit when we were discussing Whitebeard, but that's just because your entire game plan revolves around you playing the 10-drop Big Mom and removing the resources your opponent has in their life. Because when you play a 10 cost Big Mom and you don't get to take their life, you just gain a life, it doesn't feel as powerful and it doesn't feel nearly as oppressive. And so for that reason, we have to institute an entirely different game plan versus the Whitebeard matchup, which is just to go extremely aggressive and forego thinking that we could afford to play more than one 10 cost Big Mom. And in every other matchup, you're just going to try to chain multiple 10 costs back to back and just snowball the guy out of the game. So I found that matchup is extremely difficult if the Whitebeard player is good. But it doesn't really matter if you're good or bad with Katakuri. If you just high roll triggers in the life and summon a bunch of characters, sometimes you can high roll the Whitebeard player because you're just putting out too much pressure, and Whitebeard is a board centric deck. So if you just cheat your way to getting ahead on board, it doesn't really matter what anyone does against you sometimes, and that is just absurd. But I'm not complaining about it. I think it's a really fun deck, and I'm glad it was added to the game. My only caveat with bringing this deck to a big tournament is I feel like the mirror match is more polarizing than Kaido even. It really comes down to who gets to go second, who gets to play their 10 cost Big Mom first, who runs out of their 10 cost Big Moms, and if you just strongly trigger some high variance cards in the life, such as your Perospero, your Charlotte Cracker, anything that summons, it's just like you're so far ahead, and since we're both playing a board-centric deck, I'm just in a position of initiative where now I can just start pressuring for life and not focusing on solely answering your characters, and that's just like an irritating factor if you're trying to be as competitive as possible. Because I don't want to hear you go to this tournament and say, Beats by Ash told me Yellow Katakuri is insane, and I just lost in this mirror match, because that is very plausible to happen, I lost in several blue mirror matches against someone who didn't necessarily put in as much time into the game against me, and I had to live with that and understand that there are just certain RNG aspects in the mirror match of bringing this strategy, and if you can get past that, I think Katakuri is easily one of the strongest leaders you can bring, just because you have a fair chance to beat anyone. It doesn't even feel like there are really bad matchups besides Whitebeard. It's really just you playing versus yourself. Like, can you high roll with the triggers? Can you get your 10 cost Big Mom on curve? And on top of that, I think most of the other strong decks in the meta want to go first, whereas Katakuri wants to go second, and there is a strong advantage associated with mostly getting to go in the turn selection order that you want to. So being the only deck that really wants to go dedicated second outside of maybe black, most of the time you're going to get to do what you would like to do. Whereas if you're playing red, you're both pretty much just fighting for who gets to go first. And then that can give that person some really strong advantages. Also, I just want to state, I think why yellow is so strong as it being a new color, unlike black, is when we look at the best decks, they all have really strong late game bombs. And with yellow, they got 3 immediate late game bombs, the 7 cost Mom, the 8 cost Katakuri, and the 10 cost Mom straight out of the bat. And for that reason, it just feels like this is going to be a strong deck for time to come because they don't really need any more additions to the card pool, whereas something like blue is kind of missing that because our only bomb, Dracul Mihawk, is a card that cannot answer our opponent's bombs because most of the good bombs are 8 or more. Whereas with Charlotte Katakuri, we can just return their 8-drop Kid. We can return, their 7-drop Doflamingo, their 7-drop Kid. We can target their 7-drop Ace, their 5-cost Marco, which is really irritating to deal with unless you have Charlotte Katakuri. And that is just insane because it's a bomb that answers other bombs. And also it has the added utility to potentially give ourselves back a life if our opponent doesn't have anything valuable to remove on the board. I know in a lot of my testing, I found it to come up quite a bit where I triggered a Shirahoshi earlier and it stayed on the board because it's 0 attack and does nothing. And then I just played Katakuri because the other guy had a weak board and I still wanted to develop a large threat. Then I just put Shirahoshi back on the top. My opponent just looks at me and she's like, okay, I guess you'll just trigger another Graceful Charity. And I'm like, yes, I will. Or Charlotte Pudding Searcher. Either or, there's a lot of implications with that ability, so make sure if you're using Katakuri, don't just immediately target the other guy's character. Think about the implications and the weight that each line has in order to get the best efficient outcome. Going forward, yellow is just looking insane. The fact that the 10 cost Big Mom just has 12k attack almost means that you're probably not going to answer it because the amount of Dawn you have to invest on average is probably just not worth it going into that attack. And even if you do kill it, if he has another Mom, you spent half of your Dawn for that turn removing his card. He just developed another one for free, which gave him a huge tempo swing. And there's nothing you can really do about that. So I think this deck is going to be a huge irritating factor in the meta for people that don't build their decks to beat it. And there's going to be a lot of games you can't control versus this deck in general. But I think you should probably try it out because I've just found it's the most fun strategy to bring to a tournament or just to play online just because the meta is strongly red dominant. And I think this is one of the only decks I feel comfortable consistently saying I have a chance to beat all those decks. And if you're like me, I don't enjoy red that much, but I do want to be competitive and explore every strat. I'm going to briefly talk about Rob Lucci. Now, I don't have the biggest insights on this deck because I'm not a Rob Lucci main, but what I will say I found out about this deck is that one of the best matchups for it is Whitebeard, and we saw in OPO3 for the Asia meta that this was basically the counter to beating that tier 0 boat deck that we will unfortunately not be able to utilize. And for that, we saw this leader get a little bit of decline in results because it is oriented at one specific matchup. And I think it is a really good threat to the meta if you want to bring something besides red. My only problem with it is that it feels like it's a very complicated deck. And depending on how you look at that, it could make you feel good or it could make you feel worse for the results you're getting. But in my opinion, I feel like the consistency the deck brings is just a little bit lower than those top 3 red decks we discussed. And it feels like if you misplay one time, you just cannot win with this leader. But if you play perfectly, you do have a decent chance to win. And taking that into consideration, it's almost like, okay, if I play perfectly, I get rewarded by a slightly less powerful version of one of these big three red decks, or I could just put less time into the game and not feel as stressed to making the perfect move every time and play one of these red decks that are just a little bit better. And it's like, I don't really see a reason for me to spend all of my time mastering this strategy in terms of like piloting the deck, because I don't really see that the rewards are insane for what you're having to go through, how much time you're having to put in. But if you enjoy this strategy, it's definitely extremely powerful. I mean, Black is definitely in a way better position than it was in OPO2. I think that the Rob Lucci leader is a good direction for the color Black, but I think what's really carrying this deck is the new addition to the 4-cost event Air Door. I've seen a lot of people talk about this card, and I personally believe that if you have a turn 2 Air Door on the draw and you're able to summon a Bleno from the top 5, you pretty much just win the game, as long as you mill something to revive off the Bleno, because that is a huge tempo swing, and you're essentially getting a similar effect to OPO2, where if you had a Bartholomew Kuma and you summoned a blocker Pacifista, you kind of just got two like irritating threats for the value of one Dawn efficient card, and Bleno kind of takes that to the next level. Because not only is it a searchable card, it's a card that has a high level of synergy with what our deck is trying to do. It has an amazing stat line at 5 cost 6k with a counter, which I strongly believe to be one of the best stat lines in the game. And for that reason, this deck has a very high power ceiling. If you put in the reps, you do the time, you think through all your interactions and know your matchups well, I think you have the best chance to win with this deck early on when other people are not as well versed at what you can potentially do, because there is a lot of outplay potential when going against Lucci by keeping your hand at less than 6 cards when the guy's about to play Isho, because then the guy's not making you discard 2 cards, and that's a huge tempo swing for the Rob Lucci player, since their leader ability requires you to discard 2 cards to activate the ability. While that is an insane ability, if we are able to use our Isho, it essentially mitigates the cost of using that ability one time, and I think that can be a huge exchange of resources, and not only it can get rid of some of the most powerful cards your opponent is trying to play around. If you make them discard a random 10 cost Big Mom against Katakuri and they don't have another one, that can be a huge tempo swing in your favor, and the other person will have to come up with an entirely new game plan. So there is a lot of outplay potential with Lucci, but there is also against it, because the Eliter ability is difficult to set up if the opponent knows what your deck does and what you're trying to play into. So what I would say about this deck is, because it is complicated, even if you are not trying to pilot it long term, I would recommend picking it up on the sim and just trying it out so you understand the core components of what the other person can do, and give yourself a good perspective of when you go against that deck, you kind of have an idea of what they're playing into, what the optimal lines might be, because then you pretty much know, can the guy remove my character to trigger his leader ability, or can he not? And I don't need to play around that. And that can be a huge advantage when you're going against that deck, because it is very complicated, and the surprise factor and the added level of power that it brings when your opponent misplays is just a huge threat in the meta. So for sure, be prepared for this deck if you were not even playing it. Now, moving on to Law, I wanted to mention this deck because I feel like even though it didn't really get any new integral cards to the strategy, there are a couple new ways to play it. You can try the White Beard Pirates package. I don't recommend it. I think that the strategy we had going on in OPO2 was very strong, and I would consider it probably still the best way to play the deck. And that is just because Law is inherently probably the most overtuned leader in the game, and it provides the most amount of lines that you have when affecting the outcome of the game. There are a lot of decision trees that could allow you to win, making it more satisfying to pilot the deck at a big event, because a lot of times if you lost, you can go back and say, I did something wrong here. Let's learn how to correct that for the next time. Whereas something like Charlotte Katakuri, I didn't draw my big mom. I lost. You know, there's not a lot you can do there in some situations. It won't be like that every time, but that is a huge advantage Law has over every other deck because of its amount of versatile lines and the way you can tweak the deck to the meta that other decks just do not possess. And I see that being a similar advantage that we have seen in OPO1 and OPO2 long term. At the time of this recording, there was actually a recent Asia tournament where Law performed extremely well, taking the first place and third place slot of the tournament, and they utilized no OPO3 or OPO4 cards, so that just tells you how powerful this strategy is. I'm not going to talk about any of the cards because you pretty much already know what it does if you've been watching my videos, but in general, the biggest disadvantage of bringing this strategy to a tournament and why I will probably choose not to bring it is because of the added level of removal in the game. Really hard counters what Law is trying to do, being that 5-cost Marco just adds another strong removal effect that allows you to stop your opponent from generating extensive value off their searchers and maintaining 5 characters on the board. And as well, Ace, like I mentioned, can utilize Seaquake, so Seaquake plus 5-cost Marco plus Vista means you're never going to have 5 characters on the board if your opponent is prepared for that strategy and angles their deck to play into that. And on top of that, you don't really have to angle your deck to specifically beat Law because the most powerful cards in the Whitebeard Pirates package answer the Law cards very efficiently. So you just got to think you're taking a risk when bringing this deck to a big event. If you feel people will be on Seaquake, people will be on 5-cost Marco, which they will be on 5-cost Marco. Sorry to break it to you, cards busted. They may be on a couple of the other events if they happen to play Fire Fist, which for 3 Dawn allows them to potentially answer 2 of your medium-sized threats on the Law player's board, mitigating any chances you had of solidifying a board of 5 characters and getting a bunch of value off of your leader ability every single turn. And so it's just like kind of a give or take. If you're a very strong pilot on Law, don't give up on the deck. It does have viability, and you can always prove me wrong. I'm not saying it's bad. In fact, I think it's quite good. I just think there are a lot of risks taking the deck to a tournament, depending on what the event is and what you're expecting to meta call for that given event. So definitely take that into consideration when you're thinking about that deck and what you want to do with it. And let me know if you figure out any new strategies with the Whitebeard Pirates package and the Law deck, because I'm curious to find that out. Now, we have one final deck to talk about. It's actually the OG John Ashby Classic, the Blue Doflamingo. Now, I just wanted to mention this deck because it is kind of like a specialist deck. While we don't get that many new cards, we do have the new 4-cost 3,000 Swords event, which is one of the only cards in the game that allows us to answer our opponent's oppressive 5-cost Marco, returning it to the bottom of the deck for a good exchange of value and mitigating any chance our opponent has to infinitely revive that such irritating card. And that's just one of the reasons why Blue, has a good angle going into the meta, because if you go against a red strategy and your hand is well versed to defeating your opponent's mid-game threats, you can take control of board fairly easily if you have access to your stackers, and that's always a good thing to have. My only caveat for the deck is that I feel like in OPO2 and OPO1, you had a strong matchup versus Zoro, and that made it make a lot of sense to bring the deck because Zoro was just as powerful in OPO1 and 2 as it is now. But going into OPO3, it's just like the Zoro deck can apply even more pressure than it once did, And that's very irritating because if you know anything about Doflamingo, you typically can only create one, maybe two characters on the board per turn. And when the red guy can use cards like a 5-cost Marco plus a modifier to just answer the threat you generated, and he has 4-cost Marco as well, he just has multiple characters that the only way you can remove them if you don't have 3,000 swords is by attacking them, because that's our general game plan. And in that case, the guy just kind of mitigates the value you were attempting to generate by discarding a card from hand, and then next turn, he still has that card on field, and he uses it to threaten the character you developed off of your leader ability, mitigating that value that you generated last turn, and it's just a slippery slope from there. You know, I think you can beat Ace pretty well if they're on the striker build because you can outgrind them. You are strongly favored versus the aggressive build as well. I just think that it's not as favorable as the striker build. So depending on which is more popular, it could be a strong pick in that instance. But in terms of the yellow matchup, it's not very good either because the yellow player can just outgrind you with 10-cost big moms. We have no way to answer their late game bombs, as I referenced before, and that makes yellow a strongly oppressive matchup. And as well, I feel like black is not the best matchup either, just because they have Bleno. You know, they have a couple other cards that can be very irritating towards our strategy, such as maybe the Isho. That card can get a lot of value because we typically will have a decent amount of cards in hand during the mid game, since we can only play 1 to 2 per turn. And at that point, they're kind of mitigating the value we're trying to generate every turn by being a board-centric deck. It's like, you know, so that's why I put it in the specialist category, as if the tournament calls for it, Doflamingo can be a sleeper pick. But if people are expecting the deck, I don't think it's very strong at all. And in general, you don't have a good matchup against the Zoro matchup. You still don't have that favorable matchup versus Whitebeard, because one of the biggest weaknesses of blue is the 9-cost character Edward Newgate. And we think about it in a vacuum. This set just made it so much easier to have your 9-cost character on curve, and that is just so irritating for all the blue players. RIP Blue in the chat if you're with me, because I am hurting right now. Give us Gum Gum Red Rock early, please. This is getting so irritating. All in all, it just feels like since they have 4 Ezo, 4 Whitebeard Pirate Searcher, maybe 4 Buggy, they're going to get to that 9-drop Newgate, and if we can't already have an established board, we pretty much lose from there, especially in the Whitebeard matchup. We used to be strongly favorable because they couldn't access that card guaranteed, and when they didn't have that, it was just such a free matchup for us because they're playing for board, we trade away their characters, they can't do anything, and we just extend the handshake. But in this instance, it's not looking that good for us, boys. That's going to be the last deck that I think I would consider at the beginning of the OPO3 metagame. If you got this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to let me know what you guys think about my list, and hopefully I was able to make your best just a little bit better. Make sure to comment down below what you're enjoying for OPO3, what you're excited for, so you have a chance at getting those 4 copies of the promo VV that I got at the pre-release for you guys. And as always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?